could you introduce the company, since it's
Yeah.
on the stock exchange, in a good way for people, and maybe not too technical at the start, so we can bring people along discussing this company?
Yeah, very briefly, I'll tell you how we got to the point of starting the company. I mean, OET Tankers, which was went to public in 2012, 2018. Sorry, something else started in 2012. Okay, we were in shipping since as a tankers since the early 80s, and I had my own business, but I was also working with my father. And what we did basically was try to sell ships at a high price and buy ships at a relatively low price. This was, let's say, augmented by when technological changes were happening, which were usually driven for ecological reasons. For example, when I started tankers back in the early 80s, ships didn't have, of course, double hulls. They didn't even have segregated ballast tanks. And they had something that I think euphemistically was called clean ballast tanks, which meant that you could use certain cargo tanks where you would load crude to load ballast, and you would discharge that ballast legally in the sea. I don't know, you were too young probably, but maybe 20 years ago, if you remember, some of our listeners remember, there was a lot of tar on the beaches, which has now almost disappeared. And that was because ships were actually discharging legally, ballast from tanks that had carried oil in the sea. So in the mid 80s, late 80s, this changed, and ships which had clean ballast tanks were replaced by ships that had segregated ballast tanks, which meant that ships had to be a little bit bigger so they could have more cubic capacity to have separate ballast tanks from cargo tanks. So that was one big step that we followed. We sold quickly our CBT fleet and replaced it with segregated ballast fleet tank. Then the other big change, and when we got another opportunity to buy and sell ships, was after the Exxon Valdez. It was decided that single hull ships for tankers were dangerous because a simple, let's say, a puncture of the hull would result in very substantial pollution, and ships changed to double hull. Again, at that time, we sold our segregated ballast tank ships, and we started from that time on, I guess early 90s, we started, late 80s, early 90s, we started ordering our own ships, and since then, with very few exceptions, we haven't, in the last 15 years, we haven't bought any second-hand ships. We have built all our fleet in specific yards. We started building our ships in Japan, at the time NKK. Today then they became JMU, now they're Universal. It's a Hyundai, IHI, which was a big shipyard, NKK, and Hitachi merged, and they've become now JMU. But as the millennium changed, Japanese yards started becoming too expensive, and also they were not very flexible in the designs they were producing, etc. So we slowly moved to Korea, and now we build all our ships in Korea. So back in 2018, I think actually we started 17 in the winter. We knew of the IMO changes that were coming along with 2020, where the fuel had, from 2020, fuel has to be of, the content of sulfur in fuel has to be of very low. And we saw a big opportunity to expand a lot in ships that are minimizing their consumption, thus minimizing also the CO2 that they're
emissions.
Gases. Thank you. That obviously when you burn this oil, you have much lower emissions. And what we also saw that after 2015, in 2015, you got a first big effort. Parenthesis. It wasn't really the first effort. The first effort took place in the early 80s, late 70s, because at the time most ships had turbine engines. And for example, if the LCC was burning 100 and 150 tons a day, whilst today it burns 40, a modern ship. And because of the oil crisis, when oil became very expensive, the turbines, which were very good, very efficient, simple engines, were replaced by diesel engines, which is slow-speed diesel engines, which is what we have also today. So we had a big move for economizing consumption then. But after that, there was a progressive move as engines were improving, and every year you could get a few grams per hour, per horsepower less, 1 gram, 2 grams per horsepower. But the big change started happening in 2015, when you had the first generation of eco ships, which were burning significantly less fuel than older ships. And then the second generation, which came after 2017, 2019, which were dramatically more efficient. And on top of that, of course, we had the big issue with scrubbers. Scrubber is a piece of equipment that basically the emissions from the main engine go through a shower of seawater, where the sulfur is separated from the rest of the emissions, and thus you can actually burn heavy sulfur fuel with super eco ships that are equipped also with scrubbers. And heavy sulfur fuel is much cheaper than lower sulfur fuel. Anyway, so we saw this as an opportunity, and of course, Norway, we started speaking with Norwegian investment banks, and I always knew from the start of my shipping career that, and of course I have followed it over the decades, that Norway is probably the most advanced nation in the world shipping-wise, and we felt that the investors in Norway would understand what we were talking about when we were talking about scrubbers and IMO 2020, and we wouldn't have to explain everything from scratch to investors who were not familiar with shipping, like the Norwegian market was. So we decided to go to Norway, and we successfully raised some equity. We contributed the ships we had, and we expanded our fleet, and we've done quite well as far as we're concerned. We're quite happy with our performance. So that's how it started. And now we're in the Axis. We're in the Axis in the Oslo Stock Exchange Axis, and I think we'll probably move up very soon. We have all the preconditions to do that. Yeah, of course, COVID came and changed everything. We had different plans for this year, but COVID, we were going to sell some ships this year, which was something we had told our investors from day one. We're still doing all right.